Here's a question for you. Are you ready? Are you buying stocks or selling, or are you totally out of the market, the stock market? For most stock market gamblers, there's a panic in progress. It's not a sell everything panic, but instead there's a frenzy to buy everything. And so, why I want to look at this today. Why this sudden urge in so many people? And why is it so contagious? Well, let's consider. Two things happened back to back in May, and the public heard about both in the media. First, the chairman of the Federal Reserve promised the American people that there's, quote, a lot more the Fed can do, end quote. And it was coupled with his explanation and the explanation of a number of regional Fed officers that the Fed prints money digitally. If we need more money, the Fed just prints it digitally. And then came the news that a tiny coronavirus vaccine trial showed a little bit of promise, and then kaboom. The biggest buying panic in history exploded the very next morning, May 18th, when a record 2,049 stocks saw positive tick movements after the open, and it was the highest spike on record since the records have been kept that morning. And this buying scramble may have knocked out the servers of online retail brokers such as Robinhood and E-Trade in the very first hour of trading. It was just massive. Now, on this channel, let me just say, I'm not going to be giving investment advice on stocks or commodities or securities at all. What I'm really interested in and what I want us to be talking about and thinking about, and this is why I hit you all with questions to make you think. I want to figure out how we can invest our time and our talent in rebuilding a broken civilization together. I want to combine mine with yours. You need to combine yours with mine, and we need to figure out how to do this together. And so in thinking this through, this one question that we've put before you today, let's look briefly at two forms of public folly, or maybe public insanity in America. And it's happened before. It's happening now, but yes, it's happened before. It's happened in other nations before. When we have a historical perspective, we can see these things a little bit more clearly, and we'll touch on that today. What makes people respond in such herd-like, lockstep conformity when they do move in a particular direction, like what happened on May 18th? There's an old book on this topic published in 1841, which details some of the previous investment bubbles, like the tulip mania in Holland and the land grabs of Mississippi. Investor John Templeton, who did phenomenally well as an investor in the 20th century, reprinted this book, this old book, early in the 21st century. He wrote a foreword to it. And in the foreword, he recalled some of the investment madness of the 20th century that he personally had witnessed. There was a Florida land boom in the 1920s. Land went up tenfold and then collapsed within a year to the starting point. And of course, the stock market boom of 1929, which ended in September of that year in the huge crash. It had gone up sixfold and then crashed to below the starting point. And then he mentioned the uranium stocks in the 1950s. They soared, and then the bubble popped, and some buyers lost 90% of their investment when that happened. Templeton also cites the gold coin boom of 1981. I personally remember that one very well. I had a number of friends. I was in the university at that time, and they would bring their coins to school and show them off, and would ask their friends, hey, when are you going to jump in? When are you going to get in? The coins went from $35 each to over $875. And then when the bubble popped and everything crashed, a lot of my friends lost 60% of their money on what they had done. Now, Templeton never joined these public buying panics. He was disciplined. He had foresight. He was careful. He was wise, and partially because he knew his history. His own strategies in investing involved looking for real value, the real value of a thing, which was often found in assets that were not performing well at all at the time. They were undervalued, but they were extraordinarily valuable. And that's what he bought. And that's when he bought. And that's how he succeeded. That old book that he republished was Thomas Mackay's book by this title, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Let me repeat that. The title is Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And the author's thesis has lessons for what is going on right now at this moment. Here's a quote. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. That's the author's thesis, and that's what he was writing about. And he proved it. He explored that in his book, and then he proved that that's what happened. Men will go mad in herds, and they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. In hopes of getting what people will do, and this is what Mackay surveys and studies in his book, people gamble and risk their money in herd-like delusions, and they really are delusions. I mean, the delusions of my friends who were buying the gold coins was, hey, this is going to continue to go up into the $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 range. Let's get in now while the getting's good, because there's such momentum of moving up. And yes, that's what they could see, and they could extrapolate what they thought would happen, but it was a delusion. They were focusing on all the zeros they were going to be adding to their investment that they had made. So they gamble and risk their money in herd-like delusions in hopes of getting more dollars. They are investing dollars in whatever is popular at the time, land or tulips or coins, even bitcoins. Not to use those things as real wealth in exchange, but in order to sell someday and get more dollars. They're investing in them as though they are commodities. Now, Dr. Gary North, one of my favorite economists, made this comment on the Bitcoin mania. He said, this digital so-called money will not be used to facilitate exchange. Nobody is going to be getting rid of an asset that has moved from $2 to $1,000 in 1 year in order to buy pizzas. People want to hang on to it, refusing to sell, in the hopes that it will go on further to $2,000. This is the classic mark of Ponzi scheme psychology. People do not buy the investment for the benefits that the investment provides as an investment, in other words, because it is a capital asset. They buy it only because it has gone up in price, and they expect this to continue. And that's what we're seeing in the stock market right now. Gary North goes on to say, here is the Austrian school's theory of money. People buy money because it has not fallen in price, but it has also not gone up in price much either. It is predictable. Why? Because it is held in reserve by a large number of people over a large geographical area. It has become money through tradition, through experience, and through endless numbers of exchanges on a voluntary basis. It has proven itself in the marketplace as a means of facilitating exchange and thereby as a means of preserving value over time. This is not, Gary North says, the characteristic feature of a Bitcoin. People are not buying it to serve as money. They are buying it because they are in the midst of a mania, and they are gambling that the number of buyers will continue upward forever. And so, end quote. Some will get out with a positive return on the dollars that they put in, but others will lose. And losing your savings is tragic. I've seen this again and again. People who jump into the mania, but they get in late, and then things crash, and they lose an awful lot. And it's especially tragic when the investor really cannot afford to lose his savings, and he follows the herd into a losing investment. But what is much more tragic than just losing a few dollars is when citizens risk their freedom by voting in herds for corrupt politicians. Let's talk about that for a minute. F.A. Hayek wrote about this disaster in Chapter 10 of his classic book, The Road to Serfdom. Chapter 10 is titled, Why the Worst Get on Top. Why the Worst Get on Top. And the worst being the corrupt politicians of our time. Hayek points out that the worst do not get on top by themselves. They rely on help from the herd, a large segment of the population which votes like a herd. And the perfect kind of a large group is large enough to give the illusion of legitimacy to the new rulers or to the candidate who's ramping up his campaign and saying, hey, I'm legitimate because look at all the people who are following me. Look at my Instagram account. Look at Twitter. This large group must also be large enough to impose their views on all the rest, is what Hayek said. To impose their views, whatever they have, whatever their politically correct opinions are at the moment. And of course, they could change next week. But they're imposing those on others, getting whatever they do, getting into the streets, getting onto Twitter, making up cardboard signs, going out into the streets, holding them up in front of the news cameras. They're trying to impose their views on the rest as a herd, as a group. And Hayek describes these as the least original and least independent people in the country. They're just following the politically correct notions of the herd. And so thus the totalitarian politician, says Hayek, will be able to acquire the support of all the docile and gullible who have no strong convictions of their own, but are prepared to accept a ready-made system of values if it is only drummed into their ears sufficiently and loudly and frequently. End quote. So what Hayek is saying is that these vague and negative and imperfectly formed ideas, which can drown out the sounds of thinking and debate and free speech or intelligent conversation, are representing exactly what Mackay had said, that men think in herds, and it will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. So how can a panic-crazed nation like America recover an ability to think and come to its senses? One at a time, one person at a time, one child at a time, one adult at a time. Well, author Thomas DiLorenzo has something to say about this. And he explains how delusions endure over time, and then also how they're broken. Listen for his term, when I quote him here from his writings, listen for the term, the state's ideological minions, the PC social justice shock troops. He uses this term several times, the state's ideological minions. So here's his quote. No one is born with an affinity toward being a slave. They have to be conditioned into that thinking by the state's totalitarian control of all aspects of education. And DiLorenzo has made a study of this, just like Jordan Peterson has, that the media, the cinema, the classroom are the main forms of the totalitarian educational system. In return for being an essential part of the state's relentless propaganda apparatus, the state's ideological minions, and by that he means university professors, are rewarded with endowed chairs at prestigious universities, government grants, awards, notoriety, fame, and positions as exalted advisors to the government. DiLorenzo writes this, quote, all of this is why all of the homeschooling spawned by all of the unconstitutional lockdown stay-at-home orders created a genuine sense of panic among the state's ideological minions, the core PC groups of influencers. So much so that they trotted out Harvard University educational researchers, and he puts that in quotes, to proclaim that one insidious and harmful effect of the lockdowns has been an increase in independent-minded educational instruction that is not so directly under the control of them and the powers that be for whom they work. And their biggest fear, in other words, is a widespread realization that homeschooling works and that government education is a complete failure. And over the last 2 decades, now that's the end of DiLorenzo's quote. Over the last 2 decades, I've been looking at this and studying this, and I've met numerous Americans who learned to study and think in a homeschooling environment and were able to do what Mackay observed. They were able to recover one at a time from the delusions of the herd. And it was largely because of this independent-minded educational instruction and self-learning. You know, with my children, my wife and I had 7 children. We homeschooled all of them. And the amount of instruction that we gave was minuscule in comparison to all the independent learning that they were doing on their own. Once they learned to read, once they learned to research, once they learned to dig into things, once they learned to pursue ideas and interests of their own. We would certainly guide them along the way, and we did that, and it was really a fun adventure to do this. But it was this independent-minded educational instruction that gave them independent ways of thinking. And they haven't, not a single one of them, has been captured and captivated by the trends of the herd, of their peers, and of the popular culture. Author R.J. Rushdoony links this kind of courage to both faith and morality. Listen to this quote. Morality requires faith and courage. Now, here's a man who has studied the educational systems of many different empires and civilizations, and as certainly the United States. Morality requires faith and courage. It means making a stand and taking a course in terms of God's reality rather than man's reality. Morality in a sinful world places a man in tension with that world at the very least, and potentially in direct opposition to it. The moral man is governed by God and his conscience, and as a result, he is more inclined to be independent of the group and self-reliant in relationship to society. Morality is productive of godly individualism and independence of spirit. And that's what he has learned in his life. That's what I've learned in looking at the people who have pursued this independent course of study and standing alone courageously. Rushdoony has here identified the footing for people who want to be free of mindless attachment to the foolhardy herd. They don't want to be locked into political correctness. They want independent-minded education, academic freedom, independent learning, the freedom to think on their own for themselves. And so, in closing, don't follow the madness of the crowds right now in buying all the junk that they are buying in the stock market. It's a bubble that will soon explode. Instead, start investing. Here's where you need to invest. Invest your time, your energy, and remaining assets in freedom, academic freedom, independent learning. You're not ever too old to unlearn, to relearn, and to do your own research. This is how we all can recover our senses slowly, one by one.
If you like content like this, please consider subscribing. If you know others who would benefit from this material, please share it with them. To connect with us directly, please visit jeffreybotkin.com and send any questions or thoughts that you might have to questions@jeffreybotkin.com.